Good morning. Good morning, D3. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for getting up early to hear me talk about digital ad fraud. I'm talking about a scary topic, but actually I come with an optimistic message. Right? You see the title of the presentation is Digital Ad Fraud, Light at the End of the Tunnel. What I'm going to talk about today is we're going to take a quick look back at the past 10 years and why I call it a dark tunnel. We're going to also take a look forward to see some of the things that advertisers are doing today and in the years to come to drastically improve their marketing campaigns. And finally, we're going to kind of roll up our sleeves a little bit. I'll show you some of the technology. I'm a data guy, so I like to show data and analytics. And it'll be a little bit interactive, even though I probably can't hear you, but I'll ask you to think of the answer, and then I'll reveal the answer. So basically, we're going to look at some data together. Okay. So let's start by taking a look back. In the past couple of years, some of these examples are going to come from North America, but hopefully we can learn from the things that we've seen in North America and use it in other markets. So in years past, you've been told that fraud was low, right? So if you look at some of these press releases over the last 7 years or so, you'll notice that it's like 1%, 1.6%. And the most recent number is 0.82%, right? So the industry trade associations have told us that fraud is low, keep spending money, keep increasing budgets into digital advertising. And on the one hand, that's good because obviously the human audiences are moving into digital channels and you need to reach them there. But if we don't actually know what the real fraud levels are, we're going to be over-investing in some channels. And unfortunately, some of our ads are going to be shown to bots and other forms of fraud. Right. So in this case, I think most people now realize that fraud is probably more than the 1% that they've seen in press releases. So the real question is, why are we seeing such low numbers, or why have we seen such low numbers? So the trade associations tend to cite the numbers from the legacy fraud verification companies, and there's actually two problems here. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that the bots are stripping out the detection tags. So we're going to get really granular here. You'll actually see a code snippet here where they're deliberately looking for the detection tags of the verification vendors and stripping it out. So just imagine if you were a bot and you didn't want to get caught, what would you do? You would try to avoid getting detected or avoid detection altogether. So you would block the detection tags. On top of that, we're all aware of ad blocking, right? So humans do block ads. And some of those ad blockers are also blocking the detection tags. So you're familiar with the easy list, right? So a lot of these ad blockers use a list of domains. And on the easy list, we see some of these domains of the fraud verification vendors. So in that case, they also have their detection tags blocked. So part of that is going to help explain why the amount of data that they get, like if the bot is blocking their tag, they have no data with which to catch that as a bot or mark it as IVT. Okay. The reason this is a problem is that the legacy vendors have been reporting very low fraud, typically in the 1% range. So on the left-hand side is just an example of a report where we're seeing about 1-something% across the board, across all types of ads and things like that. On the right-hand side, we'll actually see another report that says most of the impressions are 0% fraud, right? 0% fraud rate. I'm going to kind of draw your eye to the first row on the right-hand side, and that's to really contrast the two columns. One is called monitored ads, and the second is called measured impressions. Anyone familiar with the difference? Right, basically monitored ads is like the total count of the impressions, so based on the media plan. And then measured impressions is the number of impressions that were actually measured with a JavaScript tag. Right, so using some technology terms, you need to have JavaScript to actually detect what's going on. Right, you can't just count the ads with a static pixel, a .gif pixel. So if you contrast those two columns, right, the monitored ads in the first row is 781 million impressions. So that's almost 800 million impressions. This is about a month's worth of data. In the column next to it, you'll see that there's about 78 million or 83 million impressions measured with a JavaScript tag. So roughly, that's like 80 million out of 800 million were actually measured with a JavaScript tag. So that's about 10% measurement. But if you look across that row, you'll see that they're still marking it as 100% fraud-free. So my question is, how can they mark it as fraud-free if they didn't actually measure it with a JavaScript tag? So one of the key questions you should ask your verification vendor is what percentage of the ads they actually measured with a JavaScript tag, because that's the only way you can get enough information to detect the bots and detect the fraud. Now, on top of just bot traffic, right, we've very much been focused on IVT, invalid traffic. There's many other forms of fraud that may not be caught, right? So on the left-hand side, if we're focused on just IVT, we might indeed catch that 1%. But there's other forms of fraud like ad stacking, pixel stuffing, ad slot refreshing or refreshing of the page. And maybe you've heard of MFA sites recently. So there's many other forms of fraud that could be many times larger than just the bot traffic. And let me kind of describe the last 10 years, right? So about 10 years ago, when the majority of the ads were shown on websites, then bot traffic or fake visitors going to those websites would be the primary kind of fraud. But since then, we've moved into mobile apps, mobile web, and things like that. And technically, if the flashlight app is loading ads in the background and committing fraud that way, it's technically not bot traffic going to a website. So if the verification vendors are not actively looking for all these other kinds of fraud, they're going to be severely underreporting the total amount of fraud. So keep that in the back of your mind, because I think you all have a gut feeling that there's probably more fraud than the 1% that you see constantly in these reports. And some of it might come from just looking at your own Google Analytics. So for the advertisers in the room, when you see the clicks coming from various digital channels, you might see in your own Google Analytics 90 to 99% bounce rates, right? So the click came to your site and they left right away. Or you might see like 1 second time on site or 1 page per session. So your gut feeling, your intuition tells you, okay, something is wrong with that, right? These are not necessarily high quality visitors because they're not really spending any time on the site. So Google Analytics is not designed for talking about fraud and bots and things like that. But again, if you take a look at some of the data that I've seen over the years, here's 15 campaigns, right? So there's 15 donut charts on this slide. And you can see the majority of the clicks that we see from UTM source equals programmatic are orange and red. So you can surmise both of those colors means bots and the dark blue means humans. Okay, so if you kind of squint, you can see that between 1 and 4% are dark blue. So these are 1 to 4% of the clicks are actually coming from humans. And the vast majority of the clicks coming from programmatic are bots. But if you didn't have this kind of analytics and you just looked at the counts, you would say, oh, wow, we got a lot of clicks from programmatic, so it must be working, right? So I think some of those data, right, some of the kinds of data like clicks or click-through rates might actually be misleading the advertisers into thinking those campaigns are working. So with better data, we can actually have more transparency and you can better optimize your campaigns. So what makes me optimistic and what makes me hopeful in the last couple of years is that we finally now have the trade associations calling for more transparency, right? You're probably aware that there's been 5 of these industry-wide studies conducted by the trade bodies to say, you know, the supply chain transparency is necessary, right? We need more transparency. And then some of the recent recommendations are to get log-level data. So that's a good idea, but let me tell you about the challenges that I've seen. So for most advertisers, the log-level data is so vast, it's actually very unwieldy. I can't even handle that kind of data, right? There's just so much data. And the other important topics to keep in mind is that the log-level data is also self-reported, right? So when you buy from DV360 and you get the placement reports, that's one level of detail. If you get the log-level data, that's far more detail, but it still comes from Google. It still comes from the platform. One of the main issues is that the log-level data contains errors. So let me kind of illustrate 2 examples. If, for example, you had Breitbart.com in the block list, right, and Breitbart kind of knows that they are in a lot of advertisers' block lists, how do you think they get around those blocks? Right? They would basically lie about the domain in the bid request. They would simply put someone else's domain in the bid request to get around those blocks. So when you have the pre-bid filtering, it won't see the domain breitbart.com, or it won't see any other domain that's in the block list. So it'll let that through, right? So in that case, what gets recorded in the placement reports and what gets recorded in the log level data is the other site, other domain that was put into the bid request. So that's what I call declared data. Anything that's declared can be easily falsified by the bad guys. So if one site is doing that to get around the blocks, you can imagine that every fraudulent website, every fraudulent app is also doing that because they want to get around the blocks, right? So in this case, I mean, you've heard of the term spoofing, and there are techniques to try to detect that and prevent that. But at the time of the bid request, everything is happening so fast in milliseconds that for the most part, these things get through. And basically, they're relying on the advertiser or your platform to do your homework after the fact to see where the ads went and try to reconcile that and maybe get a refund. Okay, so getting log level data is a good idea, but it's pretty hard to use because it's so vast, and most advertisers don't have data scientists on staff ready to handle this kind of data. And if you remember some of the recent industry studies, like the ISBA study, when they tried to match the ads throughout the supply chain, they could only match 12%, right? So they could only track the ad all the way through the supply chain in 12% of the cases. So it's actually very difficult to use log level data. So that being said, that's kind of a look back. Let's now take a look forward, and let me explain why I'm optimistic for the next couple of years. So some of the advertisers that have deployed new analytics will start to have this kind of data. So you can surmise that red means bots, blue means humans. So there's two examples on this slide I want to show you. On the left-hand side would be an example of a very large campaign that we started monitoring for a large advertiser. You can see it's about 90% dark red. So there's a lot of fraud in that particular campaign. It's so large, and I would actually characterize the larger the advertiser, the more at risk they are of ad fraud because they're trying to buy too many ad impressions, right? Just try imagining buying 10 billion impressions a month. There's not enough humans on Earth to generate that many ad impressions. So in essence, they're starting to buy the quantities that are just irrational, okay? Now, even when we see this kind of data, I tell the advertiser, don't worry. Don't panic. The idea is that now that you have this kind of data, you can tell where the fraud is coming from, and you can actually start taking some actions to mitigate the fraud. If you just get the report that says it's 1% fraud, don't worry about it, obviously you didn't take any action because you thought the fraud was that low. Now that you have proper data and more detailed analytics, you can actually do something about it. So on the right-hand side, we can actually show you a quick example. Right, when we first started measuring the campaign, you can see that there's about 48% dark red. Within the first 5 days, we could tell where the fraud was coming from, right? Which domains, which apps were committing fraud, right? By using bot traffic and other fraudulent techniques. Once we added them to the block list, you can actually see we cut the dark red in half. Okay, so these are things that we can act upon very quickly. So the idea here is that you could process the log level data, but does it help you get to the business answer or to answer your business question? What sites and apps do we turn off now? How do we make our campaigns better? So if we can do this with new analytics and not have to process the log level data, hopefully you can see that this is a more efficient way of doing that. And on top of that, in addition to kind of optimizing away from the fraud, right? You want to avoid as much of the fraud as possible. When we have the dark blue here, so dark blue means humans, you can not only optimize away from the fraud, but you can also optimize towards the humans. Okay, so kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So I'm going to talk through one example on the left-hand side. So you see 3 paid display sources, A, B, and C. And you see the relative amounts of dark red and dark blue. So if you were optimizing this campaign, which one of these sources would you allocate more money to? And which one of these sources would you allocate less money to? I'll give you a second to think about that. Should be pretty obvious. Right, so obviously I would actually reduce spend on A and start increasing spend on C. These are all paid display, so it's the same type of ad, but now I can actually optimize my spending so that I can get more of my ads in front of humans. Okay, and then similarly, D and E, you can kind of compare. The two paid search sources are pretty much similar in terms of dark blue and very little dark red. And then paid social, you see it has a lot of dark blue. So in this case, it helps you answer the business questions. How do I reallocate my dollars across the channels or within a particular media type to then optimize more of my ads shown to humans? So this is an example, right? In contrast to the earlier chart that you saw where we had 90% dark red, this is a better managed campaign. So now you can see the dark red is pressed down a lot lower, and you actually start to see some of the dark blue come into the picture, right? So these are now ads shown to humans. Okay, so we can see this in ad measurement. And on top of that, if we have the code on the landing page of the advertiser, right, we can see the clicks coming through to the landing page. And this is a great example where most of the clicks that we see are dark blue, meaning humans, right? So remember the chart a few slides ago where we had 15 donut charts that were mostly orange and red and very little dark blue. Now we have a situation where we can actually see a lot of dark blue on the landing page. So these are the clicks coming from humans. And on top of that, we want to look at whether the humans that arrived on the landing page did anything else. So on the three things on the right-hand side, you'll see touch events and also clicks. So what portion of the visitors who arrived actually went on to do something else? Because if you imagine, if a human deliberately clicked on an ad, that means they're kind of curious, they want to find some more information. When they arrive on the website, they're likely to do something else, like move the mouse, click something, touch the screen, or things like that. So those are the kinds of things that we look for. And once you have that kind of information, you can now optimize for what I call attentiveness. Okay, so you've all heard of the term viewability. So viewability talks about the ad itself and whether there's an opportunity to be seen, right? 50% of the pixels in view for 1 second. Then we're now kind of focused on attention because that starts to take into account whether some user was looking at the screen, right? So they have to pay attention to the ad. Attentiveness is kind of the next step beyond that because now we're measuring on the landing page of the advertiser to see if the people who arrived from these paid campaigns actually did something else. Okay, so now we have two examples, source one and source two. Right, on the left-hand side, we have source one. If you look closely in the green highlight, you'll see that there's about 20-something, 30% of the users actually went on and did something, right? These are clicks. On the right-hand side, you'll see in the yellow highlight, 70 to 80% of the users that arrived from source two actually went on and did something on the site. So if you were looking at these two sources, which would you allocate more budget to? All right, so obviously to source two, because the humans that arrived from source two were more attentive. They went on and did, a greater portion of the humans went on and did something else. So once we can understand the attentiveness of the humans that arrive on the site, we can now look at the next step beyond that, which is what I'm going to call rate of outcomes. Okay, so the two bar charts on the left-hand side show you that the cost, like the CPMs, do go up. So you can imagine, for the last 10 years, advertisers have been chasing lower and lower CPM prices, thinking that they were saving cost. But in fact, by doing so, they were actually showing more of their ads to bots and on places they don't actually want their ads to go. So in the next couple of years, as we start to optimize for humans, we're actually going to see the CPMs go up. Now, the question is that okay? Right? You would think, oh, I'm spending more money. But even if the CPMs go up, you can see that the efficiency on the third bar chart goes up even further. So one of the things that I look at would be kind of the rate of conversions. So you can see in the legend, it's conversions per click. So of the clicks that arrived on the landing page, what portion of those went on to do a conversion? Right. So the way this ties back to attentiveness is that the more attentive the humans on your site, the more likely they are to convert. Right. So there's a straight line between attentiveness and the ultimate conversions, even for those advertisers who may not see e-commerce transactions on their site. Okay. So this is why I'm hopeful. I feel like more advertisers in the last 2 years are being a lot more aggressive, are asking a lot harder questions to say, we really want to understand why something is good or why something is not good. So in this very last section, let me actually show you some more data, because I love data. And you can kind of see the types of information that we're looking at. So these are a little bit small, but because it's on this giant screen behind me, you'll see that there's 10 examples of bot traffic on sites. And you can see how diverse the bot activity is. Right? So looking at chart A, you can see that the bots come in very short bursts. So you can see those red spikes are very, very tall. And then in example F, you'll see that there's a large amount of bots coming to the site, right? Orange and red. Orange means declared bots, red means bad bots. So when you have a smaller website, even a small amount of bot traffic could represent 80 to 90% of the traffic you're seeing, right? So if you look across all 10 examples, it's just to show you that there's many, many different patterns, bot patterns that you can see. And on the right-hand side, I basically invited bad guys to DDoS my site, right? So this is taken from fooanalytics.com. You can see on the right-hand side, 2 huge spikes of traffic, right? So you can see the green bars. Those are like 10 times higher than the normal traffic. And then you can see that we marked all of those as dark red. Okay, so we can basically see the bots coming to the site, and with supporting data, we can try to figure out their purpose and what they're trying to do on the site. So for the next couple of slides, it's going to be kind of roll up your sleeves a little bit. I'm going to show you some data, and I'm going to ask you to pick out which are the bot clicks. Okay, so let me give you some context. First, we're going to look at 3 screenshots or screen resolutions. You'll notice 1920 by 1080, that's like a desktop monitor. You'll see 1440 by 900 and 1366 by 768. Those are laptop screens. And the little dots that you see are clicks, click locations, pixels that people clicked on the site. You'll notice that most of these dots are kind of spread out across the page, but you'll also notice that there's clusters of clicks because humans typically have to click on links, site navigation, a search box, or things like that. Okay, so there's some natural clustering. In this next 3 examples, these are mobile screen resolutions, right? You'll notice they're vertical, and you can see the same thing. Most of the dots are spread out across the screen, and some of them are clustered around places where people normally click. Okay, so given these 2 examples as background, on this chart, can you tell which chart shows bot clicks versus human clicks? So I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think about it, and then I'll reveal. So this is kind of honor system. You'll know if you got the answer right afterwards yourself. Okay, everyone have the answer? It's basically the one in red. So what you'll notice are these much larger circles. And the way we show that in the charts is when there's repeated clicks on the exact same pixel location, then we make the circle larger. So basically, you can't get a whole bunch of humans to click on the exact same pixel on screen, right? But where a bot maker can just say, click on this XY coordinate, and then you'll see the repeated clicks. So in this case, I just want to show you this visual, right? So people will ask me, oh, how do you know your detection is correct? Here's some examples of where we can actually have visual data to understand why something was marked as a bot click versus a human click. So in this case, it's really just an example where if I can't explain it to you in a way that you can understand why I marked something as a bot, then I haven't done my job, right? We have to let the data be the evidence, right? The data has to tell the story. So in addition to on-site measurements, we can do the same thing in ad. Okay, so if you look at these 4 examples, these are all 300 by 250 ad units. And each of the green dots is a click. So can you tell what these users are trying to do? I'll give you a second to think about it. You see where all the green clicks are? Right, so in this case, the users were trying to close the ad, right? They're trying to click that X on the upper right-hand corner, or maybe the little ad choices triangle. So they were trying to close the ad and not click the ad. So should these clicks be counted as clicks in your campaign? Probably not, right? So people think about fat thumb, accidental clicks, and things like that. Here's the evidence where these are people that are trying to close the ad, not actually click it. Okay, so to provide a contrasting example, if you look at these 5 300 by 250 ads, right, you see the yellow outline. You see all of these clicks are spread out across the face of the ad. So in this case, the users were trying to click the ad itself. And on top of that, even that's not good enough, right? We need other supporting data so we can understand what they clicked on. So if you look at the data below, you can see the exact thing they clicked on. So it's basically adclick.g.doubleclick.net. That's the click tracker for a campaign run in DV360. So using this kind of evidence, we can say, okay, these are the clicks that we should actually count in our campaign. It's not just bot or not, it's whether these clicks are actually valid and should be counted. So this way, you actually correct the accuracy of your data so that you can make sure you're interpreting the analytics correctly. Okay, so again, we can see that most of these clicks are dark blue or blue color, light and dark. And we can also see some of the publishers from which these clicks came. All right, so a lot of the human clicks are coming from publishers that you've heard of, not some sites that you've never heard of or mobile apps that no one has ever heard of. Okay, so in addition to just looking at bot or not, when we look at the attentiveness on the site, here's just more examples of data. Right, so on the left-hand side, you see mouse moves. On the right-hand side, you see clicks. If you look closely at the ratios, there's actually got to be more mouse moves than clicks, because for humans, they actually have to move the mouse to the thing before they click it. Okay, so these are, again, ways we can internally corroborate that the data makes sense. Okay, so finally, once we have this kind of data, we can now start to look at optimizing budgets across digital channels. Right, so a lot of people talk about media mix. So if we have this kind of data, right, you can not only look at the fraud levels, meaning the dark red, you can also look at the blue. And now with something like this, you can actually start reallocating budgets across different channels. So I'm also collaborating with Fraud Zero here in Germany, and they published a report. So be sure to ask them for that report later. They also see data on e-commerce websites, right? Because they're serving a lot of e-commerce websites. If you look closely, we can see the bot percentage of clicks that come from different sources. Right, so these range quite a bit, right? But we actually see about 29%, 20 to 30% of the clicks coming from various paid sources to be bots. So this is measurement on site. So in addition, we can then measure in ad and see where the ads are going and whether those ads are being loaded by bots or other forms of fraud. So let me just do a quick recap in the final seconds. Where we're coming from would be, we've been spending many years trying to reduce the bots and fraud, right? We're trying to optimize away from the fraud. But we were somewhat limited by the tools that we had that told us that there was only 1% fraud. So going forward, in addition to optimizing away from the dark red, if we can optimize towards the humans, that's going to allow us a new way of optimizing our campaigns. The second point is we've tried to increase viewability and increase attention. Those are great. You should keep doing that. But now there's also a way to look at the attentiveness of the humans that arrived on your website, right? So that's a way we can go forward. And then finally, instead of just increasing clicks or performance, because we now realize that bots can also fake the clicks, we now can look at rate of outcomes, right? So the number of conversions per click that came to the website. So in this very brief presentation, hopefully I've shown you some evidence. I've shown you some case examples of what we see in the data. And hopefully I've explained to you why I'm optimistic for the next couple of years of digital advertising. And hopefully you too will see the light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Augustine, for the insights. And we've got a bunch of questions.
All right.
So I shall start right away. How can you actually detect ad fraud, since you mentioned that fraudsters use evolving hiding technology? How can you win the battle against bad actors?
So in studying this for the last 12 years, there's some more advanced bots and there's some less advanced bots. And the bad guys, the philosophy is they're not going to work harder than they need to. So for example, if you're buying ads on a CPM basis, all the bots have to do are just load the ad impressions. If you're buying ads on a CPC basis, cost per click, they will also click on it. So basically, the bad guys will use bots that are as cheap as possible to commit the fraud. Only in rare circumstances where they will need some very advanced bots that are faking the mouse movements and things like that. So I think you really have to look at the business case and then understand what kinds of bots you're facing. So you can still detect them and make optimizations.
Okay, sounds good. Because there was a comment coming in from someone writing, I just hope that fraudsters are not sitting in this audience to use new masking methods in the future.
Yeah, so basically the key point here is that I want to show you all the data so you can actually understand. I know the bad guys are reading my stuff as well, but some of these things, there's still ways that we can detect them that I haven't revealed yet. So it's really, if you're just detecting the bots, it's an arms race. But I think some people will realize that if we move from block list to inclusion list, that's a much better way forward. And if we start optimizing towards humans, that's also something that the bots are not able to do. So I think it's a never-ending war, right? It's basically an arms race if we try to defeat the bots. But I think there's better ways forward where we don't have to do that.
Okay, so talking of inclusion lists, there was a question about this. Is using an inclusion list a better solution versus a block list can be spoofed?
Yeah, so I think using an inclusion list is always better because there's simply too many bad guys, right? You can't have a block list that has 1 million rows in it because most DSPs can only read 10,000 rows, right? So your block list can't be larger than that. And over the years, we've seen so many bad guys, your block list will be enormous. So if you move to an inclusion list, it's going to be much, much more efficient. Now, just keep in mind that some of the publishers that you put in your inclusion list, if they're also cheating by buying some traffic or doing some other things like ad slot refreshing, you're still going to get exposed to that. So an inclusion list is just a step or an ingredient. It's not the ultimate solution, right? But it's definitely better than using a block list approach.
Okay. Dominic writes, thank you for the awesome and shocking insights. Why should publishers besides advertisers also be interested to use ad fraud technology on their platforms?
Yeah, so publishers are starting to really use the charts, right? You remember all the blue, right? So some of the charts have a lot of dark blue in it. So when a good publisher who's not buying traffic, when they show that kind of data to the advertisers, they can now say, why don't you optimize for humans? Because I think ultimately the advertisers need to show their ads to humans for it to have any effect, right? If half of your ads are shown to bots, it's not going to produce any business outcomes. So good publishers can actually use the tech on their site to show the advertisers, look, you're getting a much bigger human audience than all the stuff you're buying on programmatic channels. So I think that's a way for the good publishers to differentiate themselves from everything else that the advertiser's buying.
Okay. There's another question. How do you measure your data?
So the platform is based on a JavaScript tag. So we collect JavaScript parameters from the browser. It's all anonymous. So because we're here in Germany, I'm going to talk about GDPR. We don't collect IP address. We don't collect user agent. And then everything else, there's no PII, right? It's all just browser parameters like the screen resolution, plugins and things like that. So with those JavaScript parameters, we're looking for discrepancies and other red flags. And when we see enough of those, then we mark it as dark red. And then similarly, we have blue flags where we use it to mark as humans. And typically, those have to do with interaction events, right? So when you look at the attentiveness charts, you can see that humans are moving the mouse around, scrolling, clicking, and things like that. So that's how we, there's a lot longer discussion after that, or how we detect it. But this is the stuff that I've been researching for the last 12 years. So I can kind of get into all the details you want afterwards.
Okay, great. Will you be here the entire day?
Yes, I'll be here the entire day. Look me up, say hi, and ask some more questions.
Great. So there's one last very interesting question. How do the bad guys monetize?
So the bad guys are, so you think, are there, Russian hackers or other hackers? There's an arbitrage opportunity. So say, for example, you have a small website and there's not enough traffic to generate ad impressions, right? You make more money when there's more page views and ad impressions. There's a tremendous temptation for those people to go out and buy some traffic. Because if you just Google buy traffic for my website, just like buy more views for my YouTube videos, there's plenty of resellers happy to sell you the traffic. So it becomes a very simple arbitrage game, right? So if you're buying the traffic for say $1 CPMs, and you're selling the ads for $5 CPMs, you've pocketed $4 of pure profit. So that's been the game for the last 10 years, because now when we buy ads through programmatic, we don't actually talk to the end publisher, right? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when advertisers bought ads directly from New York Times, they sat across the table with a good publisher. But now that they're allocating their dollars to an exchange, you now have hundreds of thousands of sites you've never talked to before. So that created the loophole for fraud to increase in the last 10 years. So that's what I meant by the dark tunnel that we've been in for 10 years. But I'm finally now hopeful that advertisers are being much more aggressive, asking much harder questions, and really looking at the campaign results and seeing if it's actually driving outcomes. So I think with that going forward, I'm very optimistic for the future of digital.
Okay, that's a great statement for the end of your talk.
Thank you very much.
We can all be optimistic. Thank you very much for your insights and for your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Augustine Fou.
Thank you. Thank you.